Language of the Soul: How Story Became the Means by which we transform. Everyone's got a story. I can't count the times I've heard the sentiment, from magazine shows highlighting the everyman on the street, to reality show interstitials extolling contestants' virtues. From the mouth of my own mother, who will shoot the breeze for an hour if you let her, with every lone fisherman in a folding lawn chair along New Jersey's Passaic River. A great documentary is said to have an emotional hook at its core, a universal story that speaks to the human condition. Even those feel-good human interest stories on the news, meant to balance the horrors of the preceding news hour, uplifting images of firemen rescuing kittens from the boughs of trees, all key into our innate human wiring for story, our intrinsic appetite for metaphor. As a filmmaker passionate about the power of cinema to transform, engaging not just intellect or emotion but all the senses, I've traditionally gravitated toward narrative over documentary. However, I quickly learned when seeking funding for my independent films that most grants go to documentary. As a two-time finalist for the Roy Dean Film Grant, I sat in on countless pitching and coaching sessions on selling a passion project in documentary format. What I learned is this: any agenda, however well shrouded in the guise of unbiased reporting, is secondary to our human compulsion to identify, to bond through our shared humanity. This is the very definition of story. The word story is thrown around incessantly in contemporary pop culture, especially in social media circles. The word has become synonymous with brand building and content creation. Along with terms like creativity, the law of attraction, and manifestation, the word story has arguably lost its nuance, if not its potency. These days, a great deal of lip service is given to telling one's story. One is shamed for not finding his or her authentic voice and contributing it to the collective. This is hardly an exaggeration. The fact that traditionally impractical institutions like art or story have taken the front seat as cultural values represents enormous evolution. The shift from a preoccupation with base survival needs to higher concerns. The problem is, 9 times out of 10, the virtues of story are being hijacked from their innate role in culture. In the same way self-help gurus and life coaches use law of attraction principles to promise the manifestation of a yacht over that of contentment, harmony, well-being, or inner peace, the mechanics of story are being regularly appropriated. Rather than extolling their power to lend aesthetic richness to life, to shift paradigms or usher mankind toward human potential, talking heads usurp them as propaganda tools. In lieu of opening hearts and minds, advertisers dangle the carrot of story as a means to open pocketbooks. If not the almighty dollar, the desired outcome seems to be political persuasion, otherwise known as power-mongering. In a tribal context, the biochemical mechanics of storytelling served propagation as bonding and affinity. In contemporary pop culture, rather than being founded in inspiration and contributing to the transformation of the collective, they are more apt to feed consumerism and little more. I may be in the minority, but I distinguish between story as transformation and story as commerce or propaganda. The power of story to provide catharsis for the individual and the tribe at large has been wired into us from day one. Far from masquerading as a work of art or a literary masterpiece, this book seeks to preserve the innate power of storytelling in its purest form. To explain my zeal, let me start at the beginning. I was a weird kid, let's be honest. At the age of 6, I stood with my grandmother on the brink of a cliff overlooking the Owens River Valley. The vast, barren desert stretched out before us, dissolving into infinity at some indiscernible distance. My mind had been grappling with the concept of eternity. Living forever, like the Bible promised, seemed daunting to me. More than that, the prospect threatened to be boring at best. Whatever would I do to bide the time? I'd finally gotten up the guts to ask the existential question that had been bouncing around inside my tiny 6-year-old skull. Grandma, what would there be if we were not here? In retrospect, I'm not even sure what it meant. Did the we refer to her and I, humanity, or consciousness itself? On some level, I must have innately grasped that the universe only exists, arguably, through the lens of an observer with sense organs and a brain to interpret the stimuli they took in. But Gram was not big on heady conversation. Her hand squeezed tighter around mine, and her reply was guileless. Just try not to think about it, sweetie. Try not to think about it. It said so much about my grandmother and her generation, I later understood. No one who lived through the Spanish flu, the Dust Bowl, and the Great Depression could be bothered with the big questions. Around the time I started kindergarten, I found myself already pressured by the adults around me. When asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, my stock answer was Winnie the Pooh. My identification with the pudgy bear would only later reveal itself. In young adulthood, on discovering a book titled The Tao of Pooh, I would understand that Pooh's Zen disposition was what made us kindred spirits. Or more accurately, that by declaring my unconventional career goal, I'd been aspiring to all that Pooh embodied. I'd lie in the grass at Burbank's Creative Arts Center, the hippie haven where my Earth Mama made clay pinch pots interlaced with macrame and her mentor Claude sculpted nothing but dragons and fortune cookies, and contemplate. Sprawled on the lawn, watching tiny molecules drift from the nothingness of space to settle on spongy grass, I knew I was not alone in pondering existence. Claude surely had similar thoughts bouncing around his imaginative skull. I half suspected his dragons had been inspired by a song that was getting a lot of airplay on mainstream radio at the time, Puff the Magic Dragon. More likely, Claude had been doing a little puffing of his own. The man's beard was bushier than any I'd yet seen in my 6 years, and he sported earrings in both ears. Claude was friendly with Ted, the Parks and Rec gymnastics coach who went home to Jessie, the male ballet instructor. The nature of their relationship was never explained. My Zen disposition extended to home life. Whether watching growing rocks take shape in a fishbowl, too slow for my taste, frankly, or gazing into murky waters watching sea monkeys materialize from crystals, I found myself reflecting on the abstract. Were those sea monkeys sentient? Aware of their own being? Oh, it was a given that they too had fallen victim to false advertising, little more than crescent-shaped specks the size of small fingernail clippings. They swam lazy circles in the dim beacon of my flashlight with its dying batteries, while the ones depicted on the packaging drove tiny cars and shopped, donning tiaras. Despite their fingernail-like appearance, I keyed into their awareness, awakened the moment they transformed from crystal to fingernail. That as-yet mysterious electrical charge that made life of biological soup eons ago. Yep, I thought more deeply than any 6-year-old rightly should. And yet, doing so was not a burden. It was an effortless inclination that made life rich. My relationship with the noosphere was seamless. I was a fish breathing invisible water, unaware of its existence. No different than those sea monkeys or the lazy, fraudulent growing rocks. Flash forward 30 years or so. Midway through my stint in animation, I realized everything I've ever drawn, painted, or written, all of my personal works, were meant to illuminate what I saw that others did not. Like Horton in Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who, I saw entire worlds on tiny clover blossoms, when no one else in my world seemed to. While working at Disney, I'd continued creating personal work and writing every chance I got. In an unexamined way, my creations shed light on the metaphysical level of life, the subtext in every moment. Sometimes in my writing, what I illuminated was psychological subtext, the subconscious neuroses or petty defense mechanisms that led to tragedy. Or other times, the collective intelligence we call fate, moving molecules and mountains despite a character's free will. Still other times it was the historical baggage or preconceived notions a character unknowingly brought into an interaction that became self-fulfilling prophecy, or the energetic, vibrational undercurrent of a moment when suspended. All the stories I had told, with word or image, centered on waking people up, inspiring them, or conversely jolting them into looking at, well, anything but the surface of things. In 2021, getting woke is the mantra of the day. If only folks were more practiced at it. I've preached seeing through the matrix of social conditioning, or the spell dream illusion as Deepak Chopra and Native Americans might call it, with every breath. In my 20s, hubris compelled me to view those who lived unexamined lives as sleepwalkers. Growing up in a milieu of alcoholism and dysfunction, denial was par for the course, and I resented it. The blinders I saw all around me were distasteful. In my heart, I knew that even the sleepwalkers had lucid moments in which the spiritual journey revealed itself. I knew that when they ignored its call, it only knocked harder to get their attention. I knew that pride and ego compelled many to put off spiritual work until their deathbed, when redemption was inevitably put on the fast track. Most people seemed to get good with God just before final curtain. My tolerance for dysfunction was dysfunctionally low. The byproduct was that I championed, in myself and others, the respect for life and oneself that drove him to strive for potential. If there was a spiritual journey, I saw it as the challenge to take the opportunities for growth laid in one's path. And yet, no matter how admirable my glittering generalities, my view of life was based in spite for all that had threatened me as a child, made me feel unsafe. At over half a century, I no longer see things in such stark terms. Somewhere in my 30s, I began to understand that we were all growing and learning the same spiritual and emotional lessons as one another due to our shared humanity, despite any appearance to the contrary. It was simply hard to recognize. We were all on unique schedules, the transformative lessons in a different order. Some people were lucid about the journey, possessing the meta-self that compels one to examine and share any wisdom acquired along the way. Others were tighter-lipped, out of admirable humility. But we were all, I decided, growing and transforming as long as we remained above ground. The journey simply looked different on different folks. Regardless of my evolving views on the spiritual journey, one thing became clear. I had a vested interest in getting people woke, long before it was the trendy thing to do. In the same way I delighted when those sea monkeys unfroze their spiny microscopic selves from a crystalline state and began swimming lazy circles, I thrilled to the fantasy others and the world had the capacity to become the best versions of themselves.